So good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Kathleen Zegda. I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation at Partners for a Healthier Community. We're excited to be able to hold this event here. This is our first event we've had in our new space here at the Community Music School. So Partners for a Healthier Community moved here recently, and we're very excited to be here. So we're pleased to have the opportunity to be able to have the UMass SEGMA team, so Social and Economic Impacts of Gambling study in Massachusetts, here to present findings from their baseline survey for the study they're doing to assess the impacts of casino gambling in Massachusetts. I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Rachel Volberg. She was part of our advisory committee for the Western Massachusetts Casino Health Impact Assessment we conducted, and so she was an invaluable asset to have as part of our team, and we're excited to have her and other members of the SIGMA team presenting here today. So I am going to turn it over to Dr. Frank Robinson of Bay State Health to welcome as well. Bay State and the Springfield Department of Health and Human Services are our co-sponsors for this event. Just so people know, there are materials on the table that you can pick up if you haven't already, the program. There's also executive summaries of the results of the baseline survey of the team, the SIGMA team, and then also executive summaries from our Western Massachusetts Casino Health Impact Assessment. So I'm going to turn it over to Frank.
Good morning. So it's really a pleasure to be able to be part of the welcoming of the team here to do this presentation. It really has a very special place in my heart and my past. Kathleen and I we're on this journey along with Rachel and a lot of other folks, perhaps some folks in the audience, around the Western Massachusetts Health Impact Casino Assessment. And so that was a 2-year journey that sort of paralleled some of the development work here and sort of opened up our eyes, and I think hopefully the community's eyes, to the impact of a casino, the potential impacts of a casino in Springfield. And it causes me in these opening remarks to sort of do a bit of a reflection. So a lot of you know that I have a big investment in energy in early education or early childhood development programs, because we all know that those first few years, 0 to 5, make a big difference. And I was really impressed by a presentation by, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was out of the Minnesota Federal Reserve. And he talked about the investing in a stadium versus investing in early childhood development programs. And then in some of the analysis that have been completed, that there's almost an 8-to-1 ratio in terms of for every dollar you invested in early childhood, between the ages 0 to 5, you got $8 in return. So that was just always sort of stayed with me, because they were comparing that investment to an investment in a stadium. Sports stadiums typically have no return on investment. So just simply it's a trading of already existing dollars, but something that often ends up having a big investment from the public sector. And so let me just sort of read a piece, and I'm going to play with this piece for a second. And this is the Minnesota folks looking at the investing in stadiums versus young children. And they say the various proposals to build a new baseball or football stadiums and improve the current basketball stadium that sometimes total over $1 billion. So they say, so we're not $1 billion, we're 800 million. But we're close to $1 billion when it's all said and done in terms of MGM. And then they pose a really good question, and I'm going to pose the question for them and then maybe reframe it for us. Can new stadiums offer a comparable public return on investment, such as an early child development program? How does a new stadium reduce crime, increase earnings, and potentially break the chain of poverty? We propose this $1 billion be invested in. They suggested there's better investments through early childhood development programs. So I want to pose, in terms of these opening remarks, can MGM offer a comparable return on investment? How does MGM reduce crime, increase earnings, and potentially break the chain of poverty for residents in the city of Springfield? And what's really exciting, that we now have baseline data that we're going to hear about that really gives us a way of answering that question. So in our 2-year journey, we found that there really wasn't good data against which we could sort of measure some of those questions. Well, we now have, with the UMass study, baseline data, and guess what? We can answer those questions. Will the MGM casino impact have that kind of return on investment for the very young children in the city of Springfield? And with that, Bay State Health is great to be a co-sponsor of this event, and we welcome you and look forward to the presentation.
Thanks, Frank. Okay, so now we are going to move on. So we are going to be having, and you'll see in the agenda, a series of presentations from the Sigma team. And then following that series of presentations, then we'll have a Q&A opportunity, question and answer opportunity at the end. So if you could hold your questions till the question and answer session, and we'll be inviting all the speakers back up here after that. So first, to start with, Dr. Rachel Volberg is going to come up and discuss the Sigma study.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
This is a truly beautiful room. I've never been in the building, so it's nice to see it's just as beautiful inside as I thought it would be outside. Good morning, and my name is Rachel Volberg. I'm the principal investigator of the Social and Economic Impacts of Gambling in Massachusetts, or SIGMA study. As you've heard, a little more than 2 years ago, I thought I was a member of an advisory group. I thought I was just sort of helping a little bit with advising to the Western Massachusetts Casino Health Impact Assessment, which happened to sort of be rolling out at the same time that our SIGMA study was just getting off the ground. And so the mode that I was in at that time was we were taking off the runway with our study, trying to put the wings on and also find out what some of the community concerns were around the impacts of what was going to be, what will be a very large development in the city of Springfield. So one of the most exciting aspects of participating in that health impact assessment was that we now have the opportunity with our baseline study and with our continuing monitoring of impacts of MGM to identify the concerns that the community has and to be able to monitor those specific impacts over time to see how they roll out and to give an opportunity for people in the community, for policymakers and regulators and operators as well, to minimize and mitigate anything that's negative and to celebrate all those things that are positive. My goal today is to share just some preliminary findings from the very large baseline study that my team and I have been working on for the past 2 years. I just want to caution you that these findings are specific to the entire state of Massachusetts, rather than to Springfield or to Western Massachusetts. And the reason for that is we have an enormous amount of data, and I'm just here to present preliminary results, and hopefully we'll be able to come back over the next many years and report on a continuing basis or on a repeating basis on the impacts as we identify them going forward. So in the slides that follow, we're going to give you a bit of background about the study. We're going to share some of the findings from the survey that we conducted last year, and we're also going to share some results and updates from other parts of the project. I point it that way, right? Okay. So I just want to provide a little bit of background to begin with. Let me get my pieces sorted here. So the Massachusetts legislature passed the Expanded Gaming Act in November of 2011. The Expanded Gaming Act allows for 3 resort-style casinos to be built in 3 distinct regions of the state. These are shown in the slide. Region A, or Greater Boston, Region B, obviously Western Mass, and Region C is the Southeast. As you probably are all well aware, MGM got the license for the Springfield Casino. Wynn Everett is in Region A, and Region C is still under consideration. That license has not yet been issued. There's also a slot parlor that was, the license was granted in Plainville, Massachusetts, and Plain Ridge Park Casino, slots only operation opened in June of this year. The Expanded Gaming Act is unique, truly unique, in enshrining the role of research to enhance responsible gambling and minimize problem gambling in Massachusetts. Section 71 of the Act requires the Gaming Commission to establish an annual research agenda to assist in understanding the effects of casino gambling and in making scientifically based recommendations to the legislature. As this slide shows, there are 3 essential elements to that research agenda. The first is to understand the social and economic impacts of expanded gambling in the Commonwealth. The second is to conduct a baseline study of problem gambling and existing prevention and treatment services. And the third is to obtain scientific information relevant to enhancing responsible gambling and minimizing harmful effects. And the SIGMA study actually addresses each of these 3 elements. So this slide presents the 3 major topic areas of the SIGMA study. I think of it as 3 little, not 3 actually, large trains that all have to sort of be driven down the tracks at once. You have to keep movement going on all 3 fronts. The social and health impacts, an evaluation of problem gambling services, and the economic and fiscal impacts. You'll be hearing from Mark Melnick a little bit later this morning. He is at the University of Massachusetts Donahue Institute, which is responsible for the economic and fiscal part of the work. So I've listed some of the research activities that we're going to be using to evaluate the impacts in each of these areas. And in each of the topical areas, you'll see that we are collecting both new data and we're analyzing existing secondary sources of data. In our presentation today, I'm going to focus on the first big population survey, which falls under the umbrella of the social and health impacts. My colleague Amanda Haupt is going to be discussing the problem gambling services piece, presenting some data from our survey that are feeding into this evaluation here. And then Mark is going to talk about this part of the work. This slide lists the broad categories of social and health-related measures that the team will be collecting. Gambling behavior, obviously. Problem gambling, obviously. Perhaps less obviously, looking at impacts on leisure activities, employment, socioeconomic inequality, health, and quality of life. Each of these categories, which are quite broad, can be broken down into several individual measures. To get data, we're looking at publicly available secondary data, as well as conducting our own data collection activities. The important thing to understand here is how unusual it is for a state like Massachusetts to actually establish a baseline and collect especially primary data ahead of the opening of casinos in the jurisdiction. It really is very unique. I've been doing gambling research for 30 years, and to my knowledge, Massachusetts is the first jurisdiction that actually has gotten a clean snapshot of gambling behavior and problem gambling prevalence ahead of the opening of any casinos. So during the next part of this presentation, I'm going to share some findings from that population survey, which is a major component of our social and health impacts analysis, and gathered information about many of the measures that are shown on this slide. So earlier this year, the team published a comprehensive report that summarizes the top-line results across the survey. I didn't bring a copy with me. It literally weighs several pounds, and it's about this thick. But all of you, I assume, who have internet access can go to our website. I'll be sharing a link with you to the report at the end of this presentation. The next slide provides just a quick overview of the methods that we used to take that initial snapshot of the population in Massachusetts prior to casinos. And I'll just tell you that the plan is to conduct a second survey using exactly the same methods 1 year after the casinos have become operational in Massachusetts, so that we can have a clean pre-post measure of the changes in behavior, attitudes, and problem gambling prevalence in Massachusetts. We partnered with an organization called NORC at the University of Chicago. They're a nonprofit survey research organization to collect the data for the survey. The sample was drawn from a list of addresses available from the United States Postal Service. Respondents had the option to complete online, on paper, or by telephone. All the interviews were completed before Plainridge Park Casino opened in June of 2015. Oops, wrong button. We were actually out of the field a year before the first casino opened. And we had nearly 10,000 people who completed the survey. So now that I've given you a little taste of the methods that we used, it's exciting to be able to share some of the actual results. To begin with, the baseline population survey asked several questions about respondents' gambling participation. And we actually got detailed information about 11 different gambling activities. At the beginning of the survey, in order to make sure that everybody had the same understanding of what we were going to ask them about, we gave everyone a definition of gambling, which you can read here on the screen. And people were then asked detailed questions about their participation in specific activities over the past year. This is a list of the gambling activities that were included in the survey. We asked fairly detailed questions about different lottery product lines. We then asked about charitable participation in charitable raffles, but also sports betting, bingo, casino gambling, betting on horse racing, betting privately against others, and gambling online. So this chart gives you a sense of what past year gambling participation looks like overall, and then for the 3 different types of lottery games, and then all the way down to online bingo and horse racing. So as you can see, overall, nearly 3/4 of Massachusetts adults report participating in one or more of the gambling activities that we asked them about in the past year. Nearly 6 in 10 report playing the lottery, and just under 1/4 of Massachusetts adults report visiting casinos to gamble in the past year. So this slide shows you some of the differences in gambling participation by gender, age, and race or ethnicity. And as you can see, there are significant differences in gambling participation associated with each of these groups in the population. For example, men are significantly more likely to gamble than women. Middle-aged adults are more likely to gamble than younger adults. And this is actually quite an interesting difference between Massachusetts and other jurisdictions, where gamblers tend to be younger than adults who don't gamble. In Massachusetts, whites are more likely to gamble than other racial and ethnic groups, including Hispanics, blacks, or Asians. In addition to asking about past year gambling, we also asked about monthly and weekly participation in gambling. And this chart shows past year, monthly, and weekly participation rates in a number of forms of gambling. As you saw earlier, or in the last slide, nearly 60% of Massachusetts adults played lottery games in the past year. What this slide shows is that 29% of Massachusetts adults play lottery games once a month or more, and 13% play the lottery once a week or more. Very few Massachusetts adults gambled at casinos more than a few times a year. You can see this is the yearly past year, and this is the rate of monthly, and there was no one in our sample who gambled weekly at a casino, probably because they had to drive a significant distance. But after lottery play, raffles, betting on sports, and betting privately against others were the most common weekly and monthly forms of gambling participation among Massachusetts adults. The last few slides focused on gambling participation generally. This next slide here focuses only on casino participation. And as you can see, there are significant differences in casino participation associated with gender and age, with men more likely to gamble at casinos than women, and adults aged 25 to 34 more likely to gamble at casinos than older or younger age groups. There were no significant differences in casino participation across the ethnic and racial groups. As you saw earlier, around 1 in 4 Massachusetts adults had gambled at a casino in the past year. This slide illustrates that about 2/3 of those people, or 65%, had visited Connecticut casinos. About 1 in 10 went to Rhode Island or Nevada, and only a very small portion of past year casino gamblers reported going anywhere else to gamble at a casino. In addition to looking at overall gambling and individual gambling activities, it's interesting to understand how gambling differs by frequency. This slide shows that overall, about a quarter of the population does not gamble at all. Close to 40% have gambled in the past year, 20% gamble monthly, and 15% gamble weekly. Altogether, past year, monthly, and weekly gamblers represent 72% of the adult population of Massachusetts. I mentioned earlier that I wasn't going to discuss sort of regional differences, but I did want to throw this slide up because it provides a bit of a comparison of the 3 regions defined in the Expanded Gaming Act in terms of the proportion of the population, a little bit about education, but then also rates of gambling. And what's interesting to me in this slide is that Western Massachusetts has the smallest population as a proportion of the state, not a surprise to anybody here. Lower levels of education and employment than the greater Boston region, and higher rates of past year and weekly gambling. But interestingly, a somewhat higher rate of participation in horse race gambling, and I suspect that has something to do with the more agricultural nature of this part of the state. This slide shows that past year gamblers in Massachusetts are most likely to say that winning money is the main reason that they gamble, followed by excitement or entertainment, to socialize with family or friends, and to support worthy causes. But what's interesting is that as gambling participation increases, so going from yearly to monthly to weekly, socializing with family or friends and supporting worthy causes actually become increasingly less important reasons for gambling. In addition to gambling participation, our survey asked several questions about respondents' attitudes towards gambling. Questions assessed respondents' beliefs about the overall benefit or harm of gambling in society, about legalized gambling in general, about the availability of gambling in Massachusetts, the likely impact of expanded gambling in Massachusetts, and the impact of expanded gaming in one's own community. It's important to note that these questions were posed to people after the Expanded Gaming Act was passed in 2011, so presumably people knew or were aware that casinos were coming, but we can't be sure of that. So it does complicate our ability to interpret some of these findings about attitudes. This slide shows you that over half of the population, 57% or 58% if you round up, believe that some forms of gambling should be legal and some should be illegal. Only a third of our respondents felt that all forms of gambling should be legal, and about a tenth or 11% felt that all forms of gambling should be illegal. Nevertheless, even though there was sort of broad agreement that some forms of gambling should be legal and some should be illegal, so obviously there's regulation that's needed there. But regardless of that, nearly 2/3 of Massachusetts adults said that they felt that the current availability of gambling in Massachusetts is acceptable. Now, again, this is before casinos actually became operational, but after, presumably, we all knew that casinos would be coming. So, but it is a little bit unclear. And it's going to be interesting to see in the future, through future surveys, if and how this attitude changes. This next slide shows that over half of the population, 59%, perceives the impact of gambling expansion on the state to be neutral, somewhat beneficial, or very beneficial, while 41% see the impacts to be, or believe the impacts will be very harmful or somewhat harmful. Again, it's interesting to consider these findings in light of the referendum to repeal the Expanded Gaming Act that took place in November last year. In that referendum, 40% of voters voted to repeal the law, and 60% voted to retain it. These results are very similar to respondents' perceptions about the overall impact of having casinos and a slot parlor in Massachusetts, with Western Massachusetts respondents somewhat more likely than those from other parts of the state to say that gambling is very or somewhat harmful. In contrast to the last slide, which concerned perceived impact at the state level, people viewed the impact of having a new casino or slot parlor in their own community somewhat more negatively than they perceived the general impact for the Commonwealth as a whole. About half of the respondents, 46%, felt the impact of gambling expansion on their own community would be harmful, and a little over a quarter, about 28%, perceived the impact would be beneficial. We very much saw this phenomenon, often called the NIMBY, or not in my backyard phenomenon, play out in many of the individual Massachusetts towns and cities where referenda were held or elections were held to determine whether or not they would be willing to host one of the new gaming facilities. One of the main negative social impacts of expanded gambling availability tends to be an increase in problem gambling. And the survey we conducted allows us to establish the baseline prevalence of problem gambling in Massachusetts prior to the opening of any new casinos. Simply stated, the survey results tell us the number of problem gamblers that we currently have in the state of Massachusetts. And in this portion of the presentation, I want to tell you a little bit about the way we measured problem gambling in our survey, and then present some information about the prevalence of problem gambling and the number of problem gamblers in Massachusetts. I'm also going to present some information about the demographic characteristics of problem gamblers, as well as differences in problem gambling prevalence by demographics. So just to give you a bit of sort of background on the conceptual issues here. Researchers think about gambling participation as lying on a continuum, which you can see on this slide. People who don't gamble, or non-gamblers, are located at one end of the continuum, and individuals who experience problems with their gambling are located at the other end of the continuum. Most people, as you saw earlier, are either non-gamblers or recreational gamblers. They gamble because they find it an enjoyable recreational activity. Some people are at-risk gamblers. They gamble in ways that may pose a risk of harm to themselves or others, but in ways that have not yet produced effects that would result in a clinical diagnosis. So, for example, they might get into a pattern of betting more than they planned or borrowing money to support their gambling. Problem gamblers are individuals who experience impaired control over their gambling and negative consequences arising from this impaired control. And then severe problem gamblers are further along the continuum. Similar to problem gambling, they have impaired control over their gambling and significant negative consequences. However, both the loss of control and the negative consequences are extensive, and as this label here shows, quite severe. This figure underscores our view of gambling problems as highly dynamic. So it's important to understand that people can move back and forth along this continuum. For example, a non-gambler could begin gambling, or an at-risk gambler could develop into a problem gambler. It's also important to understand that people can go the opposite way. So based on their answers to a standard set of questions, we classified our respondents, people who had gambled in the past year, as recreational gamblers, at-risk gamblers, problem gamblers, and severe problem gamblers. We then combined problem gamblers and severe problem gamblers in this slide and in the slides that follow, because there were very few differences between these two groups beyond the severity of their problems. So as you can see in this pie chart, the current prevalence, or the past year prevalence, of problem gambling in Massachusetts is 1.7%. An additional, and that actually represents about 88,000 Massachusetts adults. There's an additional 7.5% of the population who are at-risk gamblers, and that represents about 390,000 additional adults who are at-risk gamblers in Massachusetts. There are significant differences in problem gambling prevalence associated with gender, race, ethnicity, and education. So this bar chart shows you that men are 3 times more likely to have a gambling problem than women. So 0.7% for women and 2.7% for men. Oops. Blacks are 4 times more likely to have a gambling problem than whites. And individuals with only a high school diploma are 2 times more likely to have a gambling problem than individuals with a college degree. Now, you'll notice a number of asterisks here with no information included. The reason for that is that those groups, the number of problem gamblers in those groups was too small to report with statistical confidence. And then finally, we did a comparison of the problem gambling prevalence rate in Massachusetts to problem gambling prevalence in some other U.S. jurisdictions. It's a complicated exercise because problem gambling prevalence is measured in different ways in different jurisdictions. And so a few years ago, my co-investigator, Rob Williams, and I set out to try to figure out a way to compare apples to apples instead of apples to oranges. And we did an exercise where we standardized all of the prevalence rates. And this table presents standardized past year prevalence for U.S. states where surveys have been conducted in the last 10 years. As you can see, the prevalence of problem gambling in Massachusetts is actually quite similar to a number of studies. Connecticut nearby, but surveyed in 2006. New York here also in 2006. Maryland more recently in 2010. So in addition to looking at the social and health impacts of the expansion of gambling in Massachusetts, the SIGMA team is also in the process of evaluating problem gambling services in the state of Massachusetts. There were a number of questions that were included in the survey that help us to answer some of these questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Amanda Haupt, who is going to share some of those data with you.
Great. Hi, everybody. Do you want, person behind the camera, you want me to move this a little closer? You guys were having some trouble with sound. Can everybody hear me? Great. So one of the things that we were interested in terms of this evaluation of problem gambling services in the state of Massachusetts was really understanding how aware people were of different prevention campaigns that have been rolled out across the state. So that was one of the first things that we wanted to ask about in the survey, and that's really the first result in the small handful of results that I'm going to present to you all today. So one of the questions that we asked was how aware, or if people were aware, of seeing any media campaigns that were sort of targeted to prevent problem gambling across the state within the past year. When we asked that question, about 41% of our respondents said that they were indeed aware of a media campaign to prevent problem gambling, so about 4 in 10 of our respondents. We also asked everybody if they had seen, aside from media campaigns, if they were aware of any other type of program in their school, workplace, or community that might be geared at preventing problem gambling. And it was a much smaller number of respondents, much closer to 1 in 10, who responded that they were aware of those programs. Now that disparity, that larger awareness of media campaigns and smaller awareness of programs, makes a little bit of sense because interventions that happen in schools, workplaces, and communities tend to be more targeted and smaller. Nevertheless, these were the awareness rates that we're sort of looking at baseline, and understanding this has important implications for expanding the reach of these different prevention messages and programs. So we wanted to take a look at this just to understand reach a little bit better about awareness sort of based on subgroup. So what we did is we looked at responses to these two questions and looked at them according to different groups of gamblers. So you can see on the bottom, we've got non-gamblers, recreational gamblers, at-risk gamblers, and problem gamblers. The bars in red are that awareness of media campaigns question, and the lighter bars that are kind of brown are that awareness of other programs question. So what you can see is that over half of the at-risk and problem gamblers in our sample responded that they were aware of media campaigns. That was a bit larger than for some of the other groups, recreational gamblers and non-gamblers. And just as we saw in the last slide, awareness of other types of programs was much smaller across pretty much every group here. One of the things that I think is interesting is it'll be very interesting as we go forward, as these venues do roll out, as the state makes efforts to engage people in awareness messages about problem gambling as a problem in the Commonwealth. It'll be interesting to see how these statistics change. So I'm really excited as we collect more data as time goes on and kind of surveil this to see how these numbers change over time. But I think that these have important implications for thinking about, especially when you combine them with some of the findings that Rachel presented, really help us to think about how to target some of the media campaigns, how to expand the reach, how to create programs, and how to maybe engineer those programs so they speak to certain groups in the population and are appropriate for certain groups and communities, that the messages are salient with them. The last result that I want to share with you is just around sort of desire for help and help seeking. So one of the things that's been a challenge in this evaluation of problem gambling services is, understandably, we don't have casinos yet. There's a real dearth or a real lack of information. We don't have a lot of data about problem gambling prevention and treatment. So in trying to evaluate it, we've really been trying to reach to as many data sources as possible. And our survey, the large population survey that we conducted, has become a very important source of information about this that enables us to sort of look at help-seeking behavior across the state. So one of the questions that we asked is, for anybody who scored above a certain threshold on our problem gambling scale, we asked them if they had actually wanted help for a gambling problem within the past year. And if they responded yes to that question, then we asked them if they had sought help. If they'd sought help, we asked them how helpful it was, if they found it to be beneficial or not. What you can see on the slide is too few respondents answered yes to any of these questions for me to be able to report out to you. And that may be disappointing if you're in the audience and wanting a big result here, but I think it's very important, this finding, because if you think about this in contrast to what Rachel shared, so she shared this prevalence rate of 1.7%, and she estimated that around 88,000 people in our Commonwealth might be currently, or at least at the time of the survey, were experiencing a gambling problem. When you think about that in contrast to the low numbers of people that we have reporting wanting help or seeking help, there's sort of a gap there, right? And what this illustrates is a potential underserved population that could benefit from additional treatment services and awareness of those treatment services. So this is, again, an important finding for planners in the state and public health individuals in the state to begin sort of thinking about this issue and how we really create a treatment system that people are aware of and how we kind of get at this. So those are just a few highlights from that evaluation. We are doing other research activities, but I wanted just to give you that snapshot. And I'm going to sort of shift gears to the economic side of things, but one of the things that I wanted to say is, believe it or not, this was a lot of data, and you guys have been a great audience in processing all of it, but we've collected even more. This really is just a very brief glimpse into what we've done. Rachel told you earlier that these are really statewide numbers. So the survey was this huge population survey of the entire state. We've just finished doing all the sort of basic descriptive analyses of it. In addition to this, we also did a targeted sample survey of Springfield and its surrounding communities. That data is sort of newly in-house, and we're newly working with it. So over time, we will definitely be able to speak more to baseline conditions here in Western Mass and in Springfield and its surrounding communities in particular. That's just going to take us some time. So hopefully you'll invite us back and we can tell you some more things about it. But right now, what I want to do is I just want to turn it over to Mark Melnick, who is the newly appointed Director of Economic and Public Policy Research at the UMass Donahue Institute. And the UMass Donahue Institute is our partner. They do all of our economic and fiscal impacts research. They're fantastic. And he's going to give you an overview of what they've been up to and present a profile of what Springfield and some of its surrounding communities look like before the advent of MGM in Springfield. So, Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you.
A lot of stuff up here. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Thanks, Rachel and Amanda, for presenting all the work that you guys have been doing, and thanks to Partners for a Healthier Community for inviting us to come and share the work that we are doing. A few months ago, I got to talk at an event that the Brockton Chamber of Commerce put together on research that was being done in Greater Brockton. We had done a piece of work on the expansion of sewer and the economic impacts in the Greater Brockton area, and I was presenting that, and there was somebody from the potential casino in Brockton who was presenting too. So it's nice to be here and talk about the casinos because no one cared about me that day. I thought it was really interesting, but the issue, of course, is that the casinos are really important and exciting and interesting in all the communities where it's where it may potentially be. It's nice to be here and be a part of the big show around casinos today. So what I'm going to talk about right now are the things that we're doing on that third part of the train around the economic and fiscal impacts as it relates to expanded gambling in Massachusetts. And as part of my presentation, what I'm going to do first is give an overview of the economic analysis for us. Right now, what we're doing is a lot of ongoing work that's hitting across 3 different facilities at 3 different parts of the development process. That includes the Plain Ridge slot parlor that's already open, the Springfield casino that's planned for 2018, and then of course the Wynn Resort in Everett. There's 3 main components to what we're doing on the economic impact side, and I'll talk about each one in a little bit of detail so you can understand both what we've already done and what we're going to do in the coming years. Those components include a baseline assessment around economic and fiscal issues in your communities, development and construction as it relates to building up the casinos, and then, of course, the actual operations that take place. So obviously, as it relates to Springfield, we don't have anything around construction and operations yet. So what I'm going to talk with you about is the host community profile that we've recently completed that focuses on the industrial base of Springfield, which includes the industries and jobs that are in your community, the socioeconomic conditions of the population within Springfield and the surrounding communities around Springfield, and then some things around fiscal and real estate profile. Much like what was Amanda and Rachel were just talking about, there's a ton of data that's in our host community profiles. I didn't weigh it. I'm not sure how many pounds it is, but I don't think it's several. It's 4. But I'm only going to give a little snapshot of the things that are inside there, and of course you can go to the web and visit and see more of that information. And then I'm going to touch on a few of the additional pieces of work that we're doing right now. So in terms of the economic analysis, the goal, the objective of what we're doing is to measure and determine the economic and fiscal impacts of casino facilities at the local, regional, and state level. That includes business dynamics, such as industry trends and employment, labor market conditions, such as the characteristics of the workforce within the community, government and finance characteristics, such as revenues and expenditures, and real estate trends like sales, vacancy rate, and so on. This will be a combination in our work of primary data, or data that we collect ourselves along the process, and secondary data, are leaning on, in a lot of cases, federally available data sources collected by the U.S. Census Bureau and others, Bureau of Labor Statistics, or other proprietary data sources that we purchase and analyze. The products of the economic, so there are 3 main products of our economic analysis, which I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. The first is a baseline analysis, or tracking the economic and fiscal conditions before the gaming facilities are built. The second component is development and construction, or measuring impacts of construction as it occurs at each facility. And the third component are the operations, or measuring and monitoring impacts from operations of the gaming facilities. These last 2 components we're going to use to do econometric modeling, or estimating the economic impact related to the activities that happen in the casinos. So in a lot of cases, what we'll see with this kind of econometric modeling is estimating what will happen as a result of some sort of development. What's interesting about this type of work that we're doing right now is that we're actually going to measure what did happen, or what is actually going to happen, or what actually does happen. So in that, we'll estimate the direct impact related to the casinos, job creation both at the facility, but then also indirect and induced effects that are from the spending that's related to the casinos, and estimating what that means to the region as a whole and then the state overall. So it's the kind of thing, when I describe this to folks, direct impacts being the people who are employed there, the indirect, the spending related to that development. So, you're going to buy, the restaurants are going to buy food from food wholesalers. And the induced effects are now that people have money in their pockets, they're spending it in other ways. So this tries to have a holistic approach to seeing what the economic impacts would be to the community at large. Right now, what we've done is we've completed baseline studies for each of the 3 communities. We're currently monitoring the operations and spending underway at Plain Ridge Park, including doing a survey with new employees. And then we have a data collection plan in place for Springfield and Everett. And then obviously, if a casino is awarded in the Southeast, we'll be doing the same thing there. So here's an overview of some of the economic and fiscal measurements that we plan to be using over the course of this research. And Rachel had a very similar slide. These are very broad categories that have several different measurements that could occur within it. But things that we'll be measuring are employment, firms and wages, the industry mix and how that may change over time in the community. And I think some important issues that, that Dr. Robinson brought up earlier about poverty and household income and these kinds of things, we'll be tracking those as well. So an important thing for us is that we're looking right now how they look right now, but then also how those things will change over time. There are two key components to the types of data that we're bringing together for this research. The first, as I mentioned before, are secondary data sources. These are primarily public government data sets to track conditions over time. These would be things like unemployment rate, household income, property values, other characteristics of the community, such as native-born, foreign-born, language skills, these kinds of things. We'll also be looking at things like primary data. We'll also be collecting our own primary data. These will be data that look at the direct impacts provided by the gaming facilities, such as jobs, wages, construction investment, local expenditures. A big part of that for us is going to be data collection directly related to new employees in a new employee survey and a patron survey that would take place with folks who are using the facilities. And again, as I mentioned before, we'll be using those inputs to do economic impact analyses through a computer model called REMI, Regional Economic Modeling and Corporate, where we'll estimate the direct, indirect, and induced effects as it relates to regions and the state. So right now, as it relates to Springfield, most everything that we're doing right now is on a secondary analysis side. What we've done to this point is host community profiles. That's one part of secondary analysis, and that's one part that we've already done for your community. We're also currently focusing on special topics. This year in particular, we're going to be doing a real estate analysis and a lottery impact analysis. And one other component of our secondary analysis will be looking at match communities that have similar characteristics to the communities that receive casinos in Massachusetts to see as a type of control group. So looking at other towns, whether they be in Massachusetts or other parts of the Northeast, and saying, okay, well, they're similar to Springfield or they're similar to Everett. They don't have a casino. How do things change over time here? How do things change over time there? Okay, what I'll focus on right now is looking particularly at Springfield. As I've mentioned, we've done 3 host community profiles, and you can see these are the areas for each of the profiles. They include both the town and then also some selected data for the officially designated surrounding communities. Our profile includes things like the industrial base and business indicators. Things that we include are employment, and I realize the print's a little small there now. Employment, establishment, and wages, industry mix, business sales, things around leisure and hospitality. We also include residential indicators, things about the population, educational attainment and English proficiency, unemployment and labor force participation, income and poverty. And when we think about Springfield, these are particularly important indicators. Springfield stands out in Massachusetts in a lot of ways as it relates to several of these, and I'll talk about that in a few moments. We also look at local area fiscal indicators like expenditures, revenue, assessed property values, and then we also look at other forms of real estate trends such as sales, vacancy rate, and so on. So looking at the industrial base in Springfield, a couple things to look at, to note first. One, here's the current employment, here's the current employment in Springfield. It's about 77,000 jobs. So we look at it over a 10-year continuum, we see almost no change in employment in Springfield. There's as many jobs here today as there was 10 years ago. And we see the trend here, and as everyone would be familiar, here's where the Great Recession occurs. So we have this significant dip that occurs in 2009, 10, and 11. And over the last several years, Springfield's been coming back. Their employment is growing, but it is growing slower than the state at large and even the region. This trend line we're looking at here is kind of a fancy way of normalizing employment change over a 10-year period. I guess fancy is overselling it, but it's a simple way of normalizing employment change over a 10-year period. As we see here, 100% is simply showing that your employment is exactly the same as it was at the base year. So in Springfield's case, it's just a tick below. It's an interesting comparison, though, because the surrounding community, or the regional employment, we refer to it as Hampton and Hampshire County, grew about 2% over that same time. The state, on the other hand, grew 4.5%. So while Springfield is recovering jobs since the recession, what we do see is that it's growing slower than other parts of the state and hasn't even actually recovered all the jobs lost during the recession. Oh, one other noteworthy thing, and this is a trend that is occurring everywhere, the number of establishments has grown, though. So employment is lower, the number of establishments is higher. What it suggests is you have more small firms. And this is a trend that's occurring nationally, and I've done similar types of work in Connecticut, and we had to show the same trend. Okay, here's the mix of industries and jobs in Springfield in 2013. A couple things to show, and these are the industry definitions as provided by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The largest industry in the blue is, the green is Springfield and the blue is Massachusetts. Largest industry in Springfield is healthcare and social assistance, followed by education, finance and insurance, retail trade. A couple things to note, obviously. The first one is just how much healthcare and social assistance employment there is in Springfield. 34% of the jobs in Springfield are in healthcare and social assistance. That's almost twice the proportion as what you'd see in the state overall. If the economy were exactly the same as the state, it would be the same percentage as Massachusetts. It's twice that. It's a huge concentration, particularly around hospitals, ambulatory care, and other forms of social assistance. The other trend, though, that's very noteworthy is professional technical services. When you hear that term for an industry, it doesn't really mean much to people. But a lot of the things around biotechnology, life sciences, ends up being categorized in this group. So things like testing laboratories, research consulting, and other forms of professional services. Springfield, about 3% of the jobs are in this industry, 9% of the state overall. It's a high wage industry, generally speaking, and we see a low concentration within the city. What's also noteworthy, though, is just what is inside of here. So the ones that are largest in Springfield are accounting and bookkeeping. And what we see at the state, it's things around computer services and research and development. Okay, so in terms of changes in Springfield since 2013, as you'll recall, there was virtually no change in number of jobs in Springfield between 2003 and 2013 from a slide I showed a little bit earlier. So when we look at this slide, we're looking at each individual industry and the number of jobs that are in those industries in 2003 and 2013. One would expect that the bars would be fairly similar because the number of jobs hasn't really changed, unless there was some dramatic spike that occurred in one industry or another. What we see here is that kind of follows suit, right? Most of the 2003 numbers are similar to the 2013 numbers, with the 2003 numbers being slightly bigger. The one that really stands out again is healthcare and social assistance. We see a ton of growth within this industry. And in fact, since 2003, healthcare and social assistance has grown 42%. Now, one flaw in this, or at least displaying this, is that part of this occurs because of a reclassification by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They moved some of the jobs that are in other services over to healthcare and social assistance. So we see these two little blips that are occurring. But that being said, that doesn't account for all of the shift. So healthcare and social assistance is growing in a significant way in Springfield. A few of the subsets within that are noteworthy are around family, individual and family services, outpatient care, offices of mental health, offices of other health practitioners, and residential mental health facilities. So these are all growing in Springfield. But overall, most industries are kind of flat with a little decline. Okay, in terms of socioeconomic characteristics, Springfield is a city of about 154,000 people with some challenging socioeconomic and demographic characteristics overall. The first thing I want to call people's attention to is just the change in population, or the lack thereof in Springfield's case. Since 2003, the population has grown about half a percentage point. Comparatively, the surrounding counties, Hampton and Hampshire County, have grown about 2%. The state overall has grown 4.2%, so the population has been pretty stagnant. And as as was mentioned before around the cycle of poverty, household incomes, and these kinds of challenges within the region, we see some challenging things for Springfield overall. For example, the poverty rate in Springfield right now is 29.4%. That's compared to 11.4% in Massachusetts. Household income in Springfield is $34,000. A median household income is $34,000 compared to about $67,000 in Mass. So it's half the state median household income. And of course, related, the unemployment rate is high. 11% of Springfield is unemployed compared to 5.8% in Massachusetts. There are various different unemployment numbers that you could see depending on if it's an annual or a monthly. Or one thing is for certain is that unemployment is coming down in Springfield, but it's coming down slower than Massachusetts overall. And in fact, Massachusetts unemployment right now is under 5%. Most economists refer to that as full employment. But you won't see any number for Springfield unemployment-wise that isn't close to 10. I think the latest is July 2015, that's 9.8. So while it is coming down compared to where we were, the rate of change isn't as significant as other parts of the state. Educational attainment, what caught my attention here on this slide is what we see here. Massachusetts is the most well-educated state in the country. Close to 40% of the population in Massachusetts has a college degree. When we look at Springfield, though, a quarter of the population, 24%, has less than a high school education, compared to just 11% of Massachusetts overall. Conversely, 18% of Springfield has a college degree, compared to 40% for the state. So we see some significant educational differences in terms of the city and how it compares to Massachusetts. Another indicator as it relates to the general population is English skills or English proficiency. In the old days, a few years ago, the census used to refer to this as linguistic isolation, or nobody in your household, 14 or over, speaks English at least very well. It's a flawed way of measuring language skill because it's self-reported. So you ask somebody, how well do you speak English? And they say how well they speak it. But in this case, the idea is that if no one in the household, at least 14 years old, is speaking English at a fairly proficient level, that household is isolated linguistically and may have challenges in terms of access to public services and so on. In Massachusetts, about 6% of households are linguistically isolated. But the proportion in Springfield is twice that, about 13%. I talked about unemployment a little bit already, but we'll hit on this some more here. The annual unemployment rate for Springfield in 2013 was 11.1, compared to 7.1 for Massachusetts. Again, those numbers are coming down. But as you'll see how this trend occurred, in 2003, Springfield's unemployment rate was 8.1%, still high comparative to the nation and Massachusetts. But as the recession hit, in 2009, this huge jump that occurs, and this is a simplified table, by the way. If you look at our report, it actually has each of the 10 years in it, but for the sake of simplicity, I just hit the recession and then the current day. We see this recession number, and then the unemployment rate still similar and not coming down as fast. And again, compared to Massachusetts. The other part of this that's really interesting, though, is labor force participation. Massachusetts labor force participation rate is about 65%. Springfield, 56%. Springfield's labor force participation rate is extremely low. And I'm working on a project right now with Mass Development looking at the gateway cities, which is a designation the state has for basically any cities of reasonable size, over 35,000 but less than 250,000 residents, household incomes below the state median, and the percent of the population with a college degree below the state average. So there's a lot of cities that end up in it as 26 total. places like Springfield, Worcester, Holyoke end up in this group, as well as some others that you might not expect, like Methuen or Quincy and Salem. What's interesting about it, though, is Springfield's labor force participation is by far and away the lowest among all gateway cities. Now, what does this mean about labor force participation? Well, what this is people who are, this is of the adult working age population, what percentage are either working or currently looking for work. So when your percentage is low, that indicates that you have a lot of people who are saying, you know what, I'm not trying to look for work. Now, it could be a couple of things, depending on the way the math is done. If you include people who are older than 65, then it could be that you have a very old population, you have less people in the labor force. In the case of a place like Springfield with high poverty rates and low household incomes, it's a severe concern about people who have given up, who are discouraged workers and are not trying to find jobs. So the unemployment rate is a concern, but the unemployment rate coupled with the low labor force participation rate is a significant concern, because this is showing that a lot of people who want to find work aren't finding it, and oh yeah, by the way, a lot of people aren't even trying. Okay, this brings a lot of data points together that I've already talked about, but it compares Springfield and Massachusetts with some of the other surrounding communities. What we see here, again, total population change in population growth, we see this proportion of limited English proficiency in Springfield. What's interesting to me is that even though Springfield has a high proportion of households have limited English proficiency, the percent of Springfield that's foreign born is actually kind of low compared to Massachusetts. I know that this is going to be the teacher. I mean, does anybody know why that's happening? What is that? Why would we have high limited English proficiency but a low proportion of foreign born?
Because of residents from Puerto Rico.
Exactly, right. So Springfield has a really high concentration of people who are Puerto Rican or from Puerto Rico. They are not foreign born as far as the census is concerned. So you'll have this artifact where you'll look at this limited English proficiency, and you'll like, I don't get this. Or you'll have a high concentration of people who are Hispanic, but then you have this low foreign born, and that's because of the Puerto Rican population. Other ones that I've already noted, the percent with a bachelor's degree is low, unemployment rate high, median household income, the poverty rates. What's interesting is to compare it down with the other surrounding communities. The East Longmeadow and Longmeadow are two of the more affluent communities in the surrounding communities, and we see that here in terms of the median household incomes being quite high. Poverty rates obviously would end up being quite low. And then also Holyoke, unsurprisingly, has very similar characteristics as Springfield as a population. Okay, in terms of fiscal and real estate indicators, this part of the chapter is a little harder for community forum. If people are really interested in this, I suggest you look at it, but I picked out a slide that I felt like, okay, we'll do something that we could talk about in a group. Here we're looking at fiscal expenditures for city government. Springfield in 2013 had an operational budget of $566 million. That is a 12% growth since 2003, where the operational budget was around $505 million. The largest categories for the city's operational budget are around education, debt services, and fixed costs such as workers' compensation, unemployment, health insurance, those kinds of things. One thing that's really noteworthy inside of this, though, that's important as it relates to just the health of the city overall, is that 59% of the operational budget for Springfield comes from state aid. The average for all cities and towns in Massachusetts is about 21%. So overall, the city struggles to bring in what it needs to pay out for the basket of goods, so to speak, for the city. Okay, and then additional work. I mentioned earlier that aside from the things that we're doing with the baseline work and the economic impact analysis, that we're also going to be comparing Springfield and the other communities that receive casinos with matched communities that we think have similar economic and demographic characteristics that are not going to have a casino. So that as we track changes over time, we can benchmark that against another place and see like, okay, well, what's happening there? And it's a little bit of a difficult map to look at, but as it relates to Springfield, Worcester, Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, and Syracuse are places that we're going to use as a kind of benchmark for, as we see changes in Springfield, what might we see in these communities. Okay, and on that note, I believe your closing remarks, Rachel, so I'll turn it back over.
Okay, have we pounded you all into submission yet? Not yet. All right, well, as we mentioned earlier, this presentation is just really a small slice of the work that we have completed to date. And I want to just take a moment to offer up some heartfelt thanks to the hard work and guidance of many, many collaborators and stakeholders that have been involved in this work. For example, the thousands, literally thousands, of Massachusetts residents who agreed to participate in our survey. They must have thought we were nuts. Our funder, the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, and its several advisory committees. We also got a great deal of advice and assistance from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, from the Massachusetts Council on Compulsive Gambling, our partners at UMass Donahue Institute, a fantastic team of research assistants at the UMass School of Public Health and Health Sciences, NORC at the University of Chicago, who collected our survey data, and many, many other agencies and individuals. I don't have time to thank them, but know that you're in our thoughts. So going forward, we're going to be continuing to analyze the data that we have already collected and to measure impacts as those roll out over time. For example, I mentioned earlier that 1 year after all of the new casinos are open, we're going to be conducting another very large population survey, identical to the one, or nearly identical to the one I presented on today, and measuring the same behaviors using the same methods in subsequent points in time will be extremely useful to help us monitor changes in all of those different behaviors in Massachusetts as they are affected by the opening of the casinos. These results are going to be critical, and already have been, I think, in developing data-driven strategies to promote responsible gambling, raise awareness about problem gambling, and design prevention and treatment programs for problem gamblers and their families throughout Massachusetts. Make sure I get this right. Okay. I promised you at the beginning of this talk that I would give you a link to our website. What we are really committed to doing is to sharing our data and our results as widely as we can with as many stakeholders as we can. And so at the beginning of the project, this was one of the first things that we did. We sat down and designed a website that people could go to. You can learn a lot more about the project by going to the website. You can download all of the reports that we've produced so far. You can interact with some of the data that we've collected. And so clicking on we've got a number of tabs here. Clicking on the Publications tab will take you will give you access to all of our published materials. That includes the executive summary. We brought hard copies with us today, but you can get that on our website, as well as the full baseline report, that big thick document that I didn't want to bring today, but that you don't have to print out. You can save a few trees and just look at it in an electronic form. And also the economic profiles that Mark Melnick presented today for Springfield, Everett, and Plainville have just been posted on the website as well. In addition, we've created some interactive web applications that let you interact with secondary data that we've collected, including some of the data that we've presented here. So I'd like to encourage you all to come visit us on the website. But also, if you have questions or you want to get in touch with us and share concerns or give us information, this is how you can contact myself and Mark as well. But usually, you know, if there's a question and it's specifically an economics question, that would be best directed to Mark. If it's any other kind of question, contact me, and what I will do is find the right person in our team to help you with that issue. And I think that's it. Thank you.
So we're actually going to open it up to a question and answer session right now, and also the opportunity for comments. So I'd like to invite our presenters back up here, please, to have a seat. So when we did our casino health impact assessment, we heard from the community a lot of different viewpoints. Some people had hope for, and by community I mean in the Springfield area, as we focused on Springfield, about hopes for positives, and then also potential concerns about negatives. And so part of our recommendations were towards the Sigma team in terms of what they were tracking, because as Frank was saying early on, the only way we're going to understand what the impacts are is if we have good data to assess the impacts. And so as part of that, we had some recommendations around that. And so it's great to hear the work. I've discussed those, some of those recommendations with Rachel and Amanda, but part of having this today was to be able to invite people from the community to actually ask their own questions, and then also to comment. You've heard about the design of how they're going to be looking at the impacts over time, so to be able to comment or share comments on that as well. So we have a microphone over there, so if people could step up here to the microphone, and then we can ask questions. So if you want to just come up to the microphone. Before we do, just one question, and I apologize, I had to step out. So thank you for sharing all the information, and Rachel, you shared statewide estimates for the prevalence of problem gambling. What are you doing to look at what the impact of problem gambling will be in Springfield and surrounding communities specifically?
Right. So Amanda made a brief mention of the fact that in addition to the baseline survey, we also did a targeted survey just of Springfield and its surrounding communities. And that's on board for the first part of next year, is to get those data cleaned and then do the analysis to find out what problem gambling prevalence is in Springfield and its surrounding communities, comparing that to Western, to all of Massachusetts. But because we'll have those additional survey data, we hope to be able to drill down a little bit and look at whether there are differences, for example, in the characteristics of problem gamblers in Springfield and its surrounding communities compared to the rest of Massachusetts.
And in your report, you do have estimates for counties, although because the numbers were smaller for that, they're not as accurate. But.
Yeah, and in some cases, we had to abide, or we wanted to abide by sort of reporting standards established by the Department of Public Health. So in some cases, when the cells were too small, there were too few people in a group. For example, problem gamblers in Nantucket. We couldn't report on that because there were too few people in that cell. So it's just going to be a blank in the table.
Okay. So that's available online in the report by county. So you have a question?
Yes, my name is Michael Egan. I'm from Palmer. My question, listening to the presentation, you're talking a lot about problem gamblers, but it seems to me the one thing that's being overlooked is the impact that free alcohol will have on the community. As many of you know, in the legislation, the casinos believe that the more you drink, the more you're going to gamble. And I believe that the more you drink and gamble, the greater risk falling into problem gambling. And besides that, I started saying the legislation they passed that they could serve free alcohol from 8 o'clock in the morning, starting at 8 a.m. to 2 a.m. in the morning. And that's in direct conflict to our ban on the happy hour here in Massachusetts, but I won't go into that now. But the increased drinking or alcohol is going to have an impact on everybody in the state, because everybody in the state is going to live within an hour of a casino. So just think of all those drunk drivers that are on the road and the impact that that's going to have on fatalities. And my question is, are you going to measure where we are now in terms of drunk driving arrests, drunk driving accidents, compared to where we will be once the casino's open?
So the answer is yes, we are actually looking at that particular issue in some detail. One of the pieces of the project that we didn't discuss is an analysis of crime data that is being done by a gentleman named Christopher Bruce. He's a crime analyst, and he is starting with Plainville and its surrounding communities, but the plan, I believe, is to also look at Springfield and its surrounding communities, Everett and its surrounding communities. And what he's doing is he's working with the record management systems that the police departments in each of those towns and cities uses to basically establish a baseline of what all of the major crime categories look like in the 10 years before, or in the 5 years before the casino opens, and then monitoring that on a quarterly basis, actually, to look at, or basically to assist the police departments in those communities with how to sort of resource their officers and plan for, if there's a spike in OUIs in one part of the city, that's going to show up pretty quickly with quarterly reporting. And so the police department in Springfield potentially could, focus officers in that area or focus resources in that area, to catch people and to basically make it more difficult for people to get away with that kind of behavior.
Hi, thank you. My name is Rhonda Latney, and I'm a lifelong resident of the city of Springfield. I've been involved with the Western Mass Health Impact Assessment, the Mass Gaming Commission, and the repeal of the casino deal. My concern is, as Kathy said, gathering good data, and that's a good problem in itself, because I know for certain that when the Western Mass Health Impact Assessment was being conducted here in Springfield, that the Pew Trust gave the grant to Mayor Sarno and to City Solicitor Ed Pikula. And I called Pew Trust because that was a problem, because these two people were definitely pro-casino. And understanding the people that I know that was on the Western Mass Health Impact Assessment, a number of those people in themselves were pro-casino.
Rhonda?
And so my question is, how can you gather data when there is no bias there in collection of the data? And also, are you going to look at and consider the radius and the impact that casino has on a 25-mile radius? And are you going to look at the empirical observations as well, instead of just looking at online research or old documentation? Thank you.
I think, the first issue to address is the question of bias, which is an important thing to understand. But I have to say that my own particular experience in the field of gambling studies is that I've been attacked both by the pro-gambling people and operators, as well as the anti-gambling people. So I've always felt that as long as I was making everybody unhappy, I was probably hitting the sweet spot. I don't have any opinion one way or another on the legalization of gambling. But my concern is that if you're going to introduce a new form of gambling, whether it's casinos or daily fantasy sports or online poker or whatever you're thinking about and looking at, that governments and policymakers have an ethical obligation to make sure that measures are put in place to effectively minimize and mitigate those negative impacts. So I'm not biased one way or another, and I don't think that our data is going to be biased, but of course everyone is free to take a look at those data and draw their own interpretations, and I strongly encourage that. I'm not quite sure I understood the sort of the direction of the remainder of the remarks. Kathleen, do you?
Let me say the moderator.
I'm saying that to look at it also in the effects of a casino in a 25-mile radius, because when they were having meetings here, there was a doctor that talked about the effects of a casino in a 25-mile radius, and I have not seen that data talked about within the Western Mass Health Impact Assessment. Also, when they were doing it, I asked them, well, are you going to take a look at empirical observation, meaning to look at these areas, how they looked before and what took place, not just on gathering data across the, looking at records or looking at the internet. And I asked that question to the young people that was at the Western Mass Health Impact Assessment. They said, no, we're gathering the data just based on the internet and books, not looking at what's going on, like issues like Detroit, because I know for certain a lot of these casinos, when you talk about blacks having a higher rate in poverty, that most of these casinos going up in the black community or either poor white communities. And they're not in the communities where people that have the economic ability don't want them there. And that's why I say, and I'm just trying to be real. And this is what I know, Kathy knows me. I met him once as well. And this is just based on the observation and data that I have collected and looked at. And all I want to say is information that can give a very informed decision to make, because actually the Western Mass Health Impact Assessment was supposed to be completed before we voted on the referendum vote, and that didn't happen. So those are the things I'm talking about that makes a big difference. And if you'd like some data, you should speak with the Springfield No One Leaves, who has a nice collection of data on residents, on jobs, on the economic development here in Springfield that would give you a non-biased look at it. So check in with the Springfield No One League. Please look at their data. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Frank, one second, please. So I just thank you, Rhonda, for sharing your comments. So we know Rhonda, she was part of, came to some of our community events, and I hear your concern about bias, and so thank you for addressing that as well. And just for clarification, for the casino health impact assessment that we conducted, that was Partners for a Healthier Community received the funding for that from Hugh Charitable Trust. So, did you want to?
Well, no, that was going to be my point, that we actually earned the grant. Kathleen and I wrote it along with a guy named Tony Moto, so it came to us. And the grant, to be legitimate, was a balanced grant, so you needed to have both pros and cons. In fact, we were neutral in terms of who was in the room and represented a cross-section of the community. And by virtue of inviting a cross-section in, you're going to have folks in the room that were not necessarily anti-casino, but they represented an important sector. So again, that's, it's a really balanced perspective. And this presentation is not about the Western Mass Health Impact Assessment. We can actually do that later and with more detail if we need to. But I'm going to get back in line. My question was not about that.
Okay. Thank you, Frank. So,
Hi, good
you have a
morning.
question?
Thank you for doing this. My name is John Tansey, and my question is about, I'm assuming that the questions around problem gambling or at risk for problem gambling are self-reports.
Yes.
And I'm just curious, assuming that I don't know really anything about problem gambling. I certainly know something about alcoholism. I've been sober for 31 years. And I would assume that gambling is also a disease of denial, or if we call it a disease, I don't know whether we do or don't, but assuming that we do, that it's also a disease of denial. And I would think that the last person to admit that they're a problem gambler or at risk to be a problem gambler would be the person that you're collecting the data from. So I guess I'm just curious as to how you were able to compensate for the reality that most problem gamblers probably don't see themselves as problem gamblers. Does that make sense to you? Do you follow my thinking on that?
Absolutely.
Right.
You are not the first person to raise questions about, the accuracy or the reliability of the measures that we use to identify people as problem gamblers. It's not as easy as asking somebody, do you have a problem with your gambling? Obviously there's going to be people who lie to you. There's going to be people who are in denial themselves about their gambling. So the questions that are asked in these standard screens, and there's a number of them, typically are sort of tangential. They ask about, have you been preoccupied with your gambling? Do you spend a lot of time thinking about gambling? Have you tried to stop gambling? And if so, have you been successful? So there's a lot of ways to sort of ask questions that are not going to sort of force people into a position where they deny what's going on. The particular measure that we used in the Massachusetts survey is a fairly new one. It's been validated, so there's scientific procedures that you use to make sure that you're capturing what you planned to capture. But one of the unique features of the measure that we used is that anyone whose gambling involvement or expenditures were clearly above the median time and expenditures for all the problem gamblers in our sample was deemed an at-risk gambler because of their gambling involvement looked like it was problematic.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Joe Gervasini, and I happen to live a couple of blocks from here, which means that I will be a couple of blocks from the MGM casino. I have written a number of articles on casino gambling over the past years. I have a couple of comments. It's my contention that gamblers do not behave like tourists. But the politicians of Springfield think we're going to get thousands of tourists to Springfield. And what do tourists do? Well, if you go to Cape Cod in August, you'll see tourists. And they may go swimming in the morning, and then they'll go from one store to another store to another store, and maybe go out to eat, maybe go to a film afterwards. I don't think most gamblers behave that way. And I would challenge you to come up with a new statistic, a new indicator to measure that. Namely, to what extent do the gamblers at the MGM casino here, to what extent do they behave like tourists? Or do they just want to come and gamble and eat cheap food in the casinos and then leave? My second point is that deals with the economic presentation. If you look way back to 1960 in Springfield, you see something very dramatic compared to the present. Because back then there was something like 34% of all employment was in manufacturing. And that has shrunk greatly, okay? And the impact of that fact is that in 1960, the median family income of Springfield was above the national average. Bingo. Now, as was stated, the family income is half the state average now. So I think that's a very dramatic fact. Okay. Thank you very much.
So I just want to mention that in terms of gamblers not behaving like tourists or being different from tourists, we did mention briefly that, or Mark mentioned briefly that we are going to be doing patron surveys as the casinos open, and we plan to do those patron surveys every couple of years. And as we have been developing the questionnaire for the Plain Ridge Park Casino patron survey, we actually have been very careful to build in some questions about some of the other activities in terms of tourism spending that the patrons may be doing. So we actually will be collecting some data in that area.
Was it John? I'm sorry? Joe. Okay, great. Thanks for the comments. Couple of things. One, I forgot to, in the excitement of the presentation, to acknowledge two of the staff members that we have here who have been doing a lot of hard work on this project for us, Carrie Bernstein and Rebecca Loveland. Did a lot of the background work on the things that we've been doing on the profiles. But two things I wanted to note off of your comment. The first is I think a big part of how patrons may behave different than other tourists, I think those are the kinds of things we'll also be able to capture in the trends in industry and employment in the city overall, because we'll be able to look at things like how revenues have changed for particular industries. I think one of the things that you're noting, and it's an important question, is, okay, so if gamblers only show up, hang out in the casino, eat the cheap food, and don't eat anywhere else in Springfield, then did we get anything out of that, right? And I think those are the kinds of things that we'll be able to dig in a little bit and look at industry and revenues as they relate to industries and say, okay, well, what is employment and revenues as it relates to industries and what's happening there? So but it's an excellent point. On the industry distribution, going back to 1960, again, it's a good point. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, which is Springfield in Ohio. And so the story of what the manufacturing sector was to a community and how it changed and what the community looks like today is a very common one, and it's important to raise. And I think a lot of communities are struggling that were formerly manufacturing centers, and it's like, okay, well, now what are the things that we pick up now, and do the wages match what those industries do? And in a lot of places, the high-paying blue-collar manufacturing, it doesn't really exist in a lot of spots anymore, and it's a significant problem for middle-class families. And I grew up with it. When my parents my dad lost his mill job when my mom found out she was pregnant, and they had just bought the house, and then spent 5 years going from 3 months at a time doing this thing and that. So the story of deindustrialization, what it does to mill towns, is one that not only do I know of as a researcher, but it's very personal for me too.
Thank you.
So I have a couple of questions. One stems directly from the Western Mass Casino Health Impact Assessment. So we do the screening, we get a long list of things we want to investigate. And then the community determines what the priorities are. And so housing dropped off of that list, and so that wasn't part of our assessment. But I had this burning concern. With the casino comes potential gentrification. And it fell off because there aren't a lot of neighborhoods, more or less, in that footprint. But in that vicinity, I think there are. And it doesn't also take into account housing policy for the city. So gentrification is a concern. And are you going to also be able to take a look at segregation and desegregation in terms of residential patterns? So Springfield's one of the most segregated communities in the state, if not the nation. So I think we rank 6 for blacks, 1 for Latino population. So are we going to be able to take a look at that, because there's a direct relationship to segregation and all kinds of other indicators? And so that's the one question. And I'm just going to plop that one. And then the second question is really around health indicators. And so in the casino health impact assessment, we looked at transportation, had a concern that those folks with respiratory illnesses that where 200 meters either side of the road were probably impacted. So I thought that was cute until I figured out 200 meters is 2 football fields either side of the road, so that's a lot of people. And the routes in and out of the city are going to be going through low-income neighborhoods in particular. So this whole issue of health equity comes up as part of our concern. So our health impacts, health outcomes are going to show up in a very direct way in the Springfield assessment. I know you're looking statewide, but are we going to be able to dig down into the data and make some determination around does Springfield's populations have better quality of life in terms of health outcomes before or after the casino? And we are a community that has some of the most significant health disparity gaps in the Commonwealth, if not the nation. So I wanted to leave those two questions and sit down and listen to your response.
Okay, so I guess I'll deal with the housing issue first. There is a piece of work that the Donahue Institute team is doing around real estate values. I don't know that they have built patterns of segregation in, but I think we can certainly take a look at whether there are secondary sources of data that we might be able to to pull into that analysis. In terms of the health indicators, there's a great deal of data, secondary data, that's collected on health conditions around the state. The BRFSS, the Brief Risk Factor Surveillance Survey in particular, but also the American Community Survey. Behavioral Risk Factor. So we have always had plans to look at the BRFSS data and try to look at differences and changes over time in a number of different health indicators. So I think, drilling down to the Springfield, city of Springfield or neighborhoods may be a bit of a challenge because of, sort of the small number of people that are, it's a very large survey, but there might be relatively few people that are in specific neighborhoods in Springfield, but we can certainly take a look and see what we can find in that area.
So on the segregation point, there are ways to explore that using secondary data, and the American Community Survey is the most obvious one. I've done work like this in the past. Before being at Donahue, I was with the Boston Redevelopment Authority, so we did in their research division. So we did a lot of things around population shifts, and in part because Boston has a difficult history in terms of how the population is distributed amongst its neighborhoods and how that's changed over time. So there are things you can do around that, and it's something that I think we can take back as a team and consider, because they are important questions in every city. And I think just the other day, on point, at the WBR station in Boston was talking about gentrification in cities, and they were focused mainly on this kind of dual city issues of like San Francisco is extremely rich, or in what does this mean for middle income folks in cities. But you can explore that for any kind of city.
Yes, I have one more question. In a presentation this morning, you told us that 1.7% of people are considered problem gamblers. The casino industry would love the public to believe that the percentage of problem gamblers is very small, 1%. There is, however, a very important study that came out. I've forgotten exactly the name. It was the Institute for something, but I forgot their full title, but the report is Why Casinos Matter. I don't know, you're shaking your head, yes, you're familiar with that. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, it was a very prestigious report authored by 40 people. And in that conclusion, they debunked the casinos measuring problem gamblers at 1%. They found it far more effective when you're trying to measure problem gamblers. They went to casinos and actually interviewed people who came out of casinos, and they came up with a much, much higher rate of problem gamblers, which the casino industry doesn't want you to believe that, of course. And what they also found was that 10% of the population that went into casinos amounted to 90% of the money that was spent. And then they drilled down who were those people, and they found it was the retirees, the widows, the minorities, etc., the returning veterans. But there's a sharp contrast between that report showing a much higher rate of problem gamblers and your analysis showing, which is in line with the casino industry, showing a much smaller rate of 1.7, which is why the general population says, well, if there's only a problem with 1.7%, then what's the difficulty with having a casino? Well, it's far greater than that, according to that report. I'd like your comment on that.
Well, I guess as a social scientist, I would say it's a sampling issue, because the prevalence rate that we found was for the entire adult population of Massachusetts. When you start looking at problem gambling prevalence rates amongst past year gamblers, the 1.7% actually increases slightly to about 2.3% because you're just looking at problem gambling prevalence amongst people who have gambled. When you start drilling down into people who do specific types of gambling, or have done some have been to a casino, for example, in the past year, prevalence rates are going to be higher because that represents a much smaller proportion of the population. So the Institute for American Values, I believe, is the report that you are referencing. I did take the time to read that report. They actually included a fair amount of information from studies that I have produced over my 30-year career. It certainly is a prestigious report, but as much as I recognize that there's a view of the casino industry as biased, there's also bias by the anti-casino folks. And so that report very much was framed by the interest of those 40 authors in preventing the expansion of casino gambling any further in the United States.
So you feel that was a biased report?
I felt that the evidence that was assembled was certainly in support of a particular argument.
I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions.
So it's a comment and a question. Mine are around the slides that Dr. Melnick presented around the economics. So I was grateful for your explaining the labor force participation piece, because we look at 11% and we're struck by how much higher that is, but we recognize when you explain that there's really a significantly larger portion of the population that are not employed because of the lack of participation. I think it's really helpful for you to articulate that. I volunteer with a number of nonprofits. We're writing grants for everything, so that helps us to tell the story. But my question is around why you lump together healthcare and other social service organizations together. And the reason I want to ask is because at first glance we think, well, it's because Bay State's here and they're a big employer. But the second part of that is if it's social service organizations, well, of course they're a larger employer because of disparities and the great need we have. And I don't know, it just doesn't seem completely transparent to me to lock it all together.
Sure. So this will be me deflecting. So I didn't lump them together. The Bureau of Labor Statistics lumps them together. And so it is problematic where you have one side of that industry, which is going to be hospitals and things around, other activities around doctors and nurses and these kinds of things. And then related to that are going to be retirement communities, drug treatment facilities, other forms of social. So it's significant, and it can be disentangled because the NAICS the system that's used there is called the North American Industrial Classification System. What we presented there is what's called the 2-digit level of NAICS, and there's about 20 industries that you'll see going across that. NAICS codes go out actually all the way out to about 9 to 10 digits. And so if you imagine manufacturing is actually code 31, Food manufacturing will be 311. Dog food manufacturing will be 3111. Organic dog food manufacturing will be, so the point is that it's conceivable and doable to drill down to other industries within these major subsets to see how these things look different than one another. We talk about this a bit within the report about some of the sub-industries that are within it. But for the sake of presentation, the lumping is more, this is how the classification system is put together, and all of them are somewhat flawed. But so you're right, and in particular in Springfield, there is kind of this dual cut because there's significant hospital facilities that are in the city, but then there's also significant social service. So it's not, whereas for Boston, for example, we have massive teaching hospitals. I'm based in Boston. So we have massive teaching hospitals. We also have social assistants, but there's research hospitals. So it's a little bit different how that plays out, but so it is a good point.
My name is Betsy Johnson. I'm a Springfield resident. 2 questions. We seem to have a lot of conversation about the impacts of gambling as related to casinos, but there does not seem to be the same public discourse over the course of years about the lottery. And so one of my questions is, as you're tracking the impact of new casinos, will you be continuing, will there be any looking at how that impact of lottery gambling, which involves a lot more people, will be, leading to problem gambling or related to who goes to a casino, or is it increasing or going down? And then just one other comment, or question, when you're doing your more Springfield-specific survey, you kept calling it the Springfield and surrounding communities. Those particular surrounding communities really, I think, corrupt what impacts you get related to Springfield itself, because the Long Meadows and East Long Meadows, et cetera, are so different from Springfield. And how is that being taken into consideration?
So the first question about the lottery, we are doing, as you saw in the presentation, we are planning to measure lottery participation by the respondents in our surveys. We also have one of the members of the economics team is actually working on an analysis of the impact of Plain Ridge Park Casino in terms of what is the impact of the casino on lottery sales in I believe it's a 5, 10, and is it 15 or 20? Anyway, so expanding radii around the casino itself. My sense is that that lottery sales analysis is going to be informative in terms of what the impact of the casino is on lottery sales, but we'll also be looking at lottery participation and behavior. And so we'll have a number of ways to sort of triangulate on that lottery issue. I just want to mention that the Expanded Gaming Act specifically charges the Massachusetts Gaming Commission with making sure that the lottery is not harmed or negatively impacted. And so the Gaming Commission takes that very seriously, and we have certainly been tasked with looking at the impact of these casinos on lottery spending and lottery participation as we move forward. The second question.
How specific? How is there much specific?
So the targeted sample is an additional 1,100 interviews that we did with folks from Springfield and, as I mentioned, the surrounding communities. And we are still in the process of, or we will be cleaning those data and getting them ready for analysis, but I do think that once we go to analyze them, we are probably going to want to split out say folks from Longmeadow and East Longmeadow, from Springfield and Holyoke. And there's going to be some things that we can do and some things that we can't do because of the size of the sample and the number of people. If it gets too small, you lose confidence statistically in the results, but we will definitely be looking at that to see if we can see some differences.
Great, thank you. Thank you all. So I'd like to invite Jessica Collins, our Executive Director at Partners for Healthier Community, to do closing.
So thank you all very much for coming, UMass, you guys. This was wonderful to have the follow-up discussion and to continue to be informed as a community about how economic development endeavors will affect us as a community and a region. And I think methodologies and exercises like this, though not perfect at all, should become more the norm, and hopefully will become more the norm in our region, so that we can have a marriage of economic development, planning and transportation, and public health. 21st century cities that are thriving across our country are highlighting that marriage, and we need to do that here as well. And I think this is a perfect example of us doing that. So thank you so much for coming. I want to thank Eileen McCaffrey and the Community Music School of Springfield for allowing us to have this beautiful space, and enjoy the rest of your day.